Prince Harry sits quietly as Joy Behar challenges him directly, and the tension in the room instantly rises. What happens when a routine conversation on live television takes an unexpected turn? Make sure to subscribe to Prime Voice and like and comment for more real talk show coverage. It begins like many segments on The View, a familiar rhythm, a conversational tone, and a panel easing into a topic that feels both current and personal. On this particular episode, the discussion centers around public life, media scrutiny, and the evolving role of public figures in shaping their own narratives. The guest for the segment is Prince Harry, who joins the panel remotely, seated in a calm, neutral setting that contrasts with the bright, energetic studio environment. From the outset, the tone is respectful and measured. The hosts introduce him with a brief recap of his recent public appearances and ongoing projects, touching on themes that have been consistent in his public messaging: mental health, privacy, and his experiences with media attention. The conversation initially flows smoothly, with Harry responding in a composed and thoughtful manner, offering insight without appearing defensive. Joy Behar, known for her direct style and willingness to challenge guests, listens attentively during the opening exchange. She nods occasionally, but her expression suggests she is preparing to engage more critically. When it becomes her turn to speak, she leans slightly forward, her tone still conversational but carrying a subtle shift in intent. She begins by acknowledging Harry's perspective, noting that his experiences are unique but also highly visible. Then she transitions into a broader point about public accountability. Her question is framed carefully, but there's a clear edge to it. She asks whether stepping away from official royal duties while continuing to speak publicly about those experiences creates a kind of contradiction, remaining in the spotlight while expressing a desire for privacy. At this stage, the atmosphere in the studio changes almost imperceptibly. The other co-hosts shift in their seats, sensing that the conversation is moving into more sensitive territory. Harry listens without interruption, maintaining eye contact with the camera. When he responds, his tone remains calm, but there is a noticeable firmness in how he chooses his words. He explains that stepping back was never about avoiding responsibility, but about creating boundaries that allowed him and his family to function in a healthier way. He emphasizes that speaking out is part of addressing issues he believes are important, particularly when it comes to mental health and the impact of media coverage. His response is measured, but it directly addresses the implication in Joy's question. Joy listens, but she doesn't fully step back. Instead, she follows up with a point that many viewers might recognize as a common critique. She suggests that by continuing to participate in interviews, documentaries, and public discussions, there's an ongoing engagement with the very systems he has criticized. Her tone isn't confrontational in a dramatic sense, but it is persistent. There's a brief pause after she finishes speaking. It's the kind of pause that often happens on live television when both sides are considering how to proceed. One of the other hosts briefly interjects, attempting to broaden the discussion by bringing in the idea of public expectations versus personal boundaries. This moment acts as a slight buffer, easing the tension just enough to keep the conversation balanced. Harry responds again, this time with a bit more clarity in his stance. He acknowledges that the situation is complex and that there isn't a simple way to navigate public life after stepping away from an institution like the royal family. He points out that sharing his experiences is not about maintaining visibility for its own sake, but about contributing to conversations that he feels have long been avoided or minimized. As he speaks, his body language remains composed, shoulders relaxed, posture steady, but his delivery carries more emphasis than before. It's not emotional in an overt way, but there is a clear sense that he is drawing a line in how his intentions are being interpreted. The studio audience remains quiet, listening closely. Unlike segments that include frequent applause or laughter, this moment holds a more attentive silence. The hosts also appear more focused, with fewer interruptions than usual. It's evident that the conversation has shifted from a general discussion into something more pointed. Joy, maintaining her role in the exchange, nods as Harry finishes. She doesn't dismiss his response, but she also doesn't fully concede the point. Instead, she reframes her perspective slightly, suggesting that public figures often face a difficult balance between controlling their narrative and accepting the scrutiny that comes with visibility. Her tone softens just enough to keep the discussion from feeling adversarial, but the underlying tension remains. Another co-host steps in again, this time asking a question that redirects the conversation toward solutions. How public figures can manage media relationships in a healthier way. This allows Harry to expand on his earlier points without directly responding to criticism. He speaks about the importance of responsible journalism and the need for systemic change in how stories are reported and consumed. For a moment, the conversation regains a sense of equilibrium. The pacing slows, and the tone becomes more reflective. However, the earlier exchange between Joy and Harry lingers in the background, subtly influencing how each subsequent comment is received. As the segment continues, it becomes clear that the discussion is not simply about one individual's experience, but about broader questions of media, accountability, and personal boundaries. The hosts each bring their own perspectives, but there's a noticeable awareness of the dynamic that has developed. From a viewer's standpoint, this is the kind of moment that stands out not because of raised voices or dramatic reactions, but because of the shift in tone. It's a reminder of how live television can move from routine conversation into something more meaningful, simply through the way questions are asked and answered. The camera occasionally cuts to different angles, close-ups of the hosts, a wider shot of the panel, and a steady frame on Harry. These visual cues reinforce the sense that the conversation is being carefully managed, even as it unfolds in real time. As part one comes to a close, the discussion remains ongoing, with both sides maintaining their positions while continuing to engage respectfully. The tension is present, but it is controlled, grounded in the kind of measured dialogue that defines daytime talk shows. And for viewers watching live, it's clear that this exchange is setting the stage for a deeper conversation still to come. As the segment continues, the tone remains steady, but there's a noticeable shift in how carefully each person on the panel is choosing their words. What had started as a broad discussion about public life has now settled into a more focused exchange, with the earlier comments from Joy Behar and Prince Harry still shaping the direction of the conversation. One of the co-hosts steps in with a question that seems designed to ease the tension slightly, asking Harry to expand on how he defines privacy in a modern media environment. The question is framed in a neutral way, almost as if to give him space to clarify without directly revisiting the earlier challenge. Harry takes a moment before answering, and that pause is noticeable. It's not long, but it's enough to signal that he's being deliberate. He explains that for him, privacy isn't about complete withdrawal from public life. Instead, he describes it as having control over what aspects of his life are shared and how they are presented. He speaks in a calm, measured tone, emphasizing that the issue is less about visibility and more about consent, about having a say in the narrative rather than being defined by it. As he speaks, the camera cuts briefly to Joy, who is listening with a composed expression. She isn't interrupting, but her posture suggests she's still engaged in evaluating his response. The rest of the panel appears attentive, with minimal movement, creating a quieter, more focused atmosphere than earlier in the segment. Harry continues by referencing the broader impact of media coverage, noting that it's not just about public perception, but also about personal well-being. He mentions the cumulative effect of constant scrutiny, particularly when it crosses into speculation or misrepresentation. His tone remains even, but there's a subtle emphasis in how he frames these points, as if reinforcing the seriousness of the issue. At this point, Joy leans slightly forward again, signaling that she's about to respond. When she speaks, her tone is still controlled, but there's a renewed directness in her approach. She acknowledges what Harry has said, but raises a follow-up point that brings the conversation back into a more challenging space. She suggests that while the idea of controlling one's narrative is understandable, it can be difficult to reconcile with participation in high-profile media projects. Without referencing any specific example in detail, she alludes to the broader pattern of public appearances and storytelling, asking whether that level of engagement naturally invites the kind of attention he's trying to limit. There's a brief moment where the other hosts glance at each other, a subtle indication that they recognize the question as a continuation of the earlier tension. The audience remains quiet, with no audible reactions, which adds to the sense that this is a more serious, reflective exchange rather than a typical back and forth. Harry responds without hesitation this time. His voice remains steady, but there's a slight shift in his delivery, more concise, more focused. He explains that choosing to speak on certain platforms or projects is different from being the subject of unsolicited coverage. He draws a clear distinction between intentional communication and what he describes as invasive reporting. As he speaks, his expression stays composed, but his eye contact with the camera becomes more fixed. It's the kind of visual cue that suggests he's fully engaged and intent on making his point clear. He reiterates that participating in conversations about his experiences is, in his view, a way to address issues that have affected not only him, but others in similar positions. Joy listens, nodding occasionally, but when he finishes, she follows up again, this time with a slightly softer tone. She reframes her perspective, saying that from a viewer's standpoint, the distinction might not always be clear. She points out that audiences often see public figures as consistently visible, regardless of the context, and that this can shape how their messages are received. This shift in her tone changes the dynamic slightly. It feels less like a direct challenge and more like an attempt to bridge the gap between perspectives. One of the other co-hosts picks up on this and adds a comment about the role of audience perception, noting that public figures often have to navigate not just their own intentions, but also how those intentions are interpreted. The conversation begins to open up again, moving away from a one-on-one exchange and back toward a panel discussion. However, the earlier tension hasn't fully dissipated. It's still present, influencing the pacing and tone of each response. Harry acknowledges the point about perception, agreeing that it can be difficult to control how messages are received. He emphasizes that while he can't dictate public interpretation, he can be intentional about what he shares and why. His tone here is slightly more reflective, suggesting a willingness to engage with the complexity of the issue rather than simply defend his position. As the discussion continues, another co-host brings up the idea of responsibility, both for public figures and for media outlets. This introduces a broader perspective, allowing the conversation to expand beyond the specifics of Harry's experience. The panel begins to explore how accountability works on both sides, with each person offering their viewpoint. Joy contributes to this part of the discussion as well, and her tone now feels more balanced. She acknowledges that media coverage can sometimes cross boundaries, while also maintaining that public engagement inevitably comes with a certain level of scrutiny. Her comments are measured, and she appears to be making an effort to keep the conversation constructive. Throughout this exchange, the body language across the panel reflects a careful balance. There are fewer interruptions, more pauses between responses, and a noticeable effort to let each person finish their thoughts. The pacing is slower than at the start of the segment, giving the discussion a more deliberate feel. From the audience's perspective, this is the kind of conversation that invites attention rather than reaction. There are no overt displays of disagreement, no raised voices or sharp interruptions, but the underlying differences in perspective are clear. It's a nuanced exchange, one that relies on tone and phrasing rather than dramatic moments. As the camera shifts between speakers, it occasionally captures subtle reactions, small nods, slight changes in expression, brief glances between co-hosts. These details add to the sense that the conversation is unfolding in real time, with each participant adjusting to the direction it's taking. By the time this portion of the segment nears its end, the discussion has settled into a more thoughtful rhythm. The initial tension has evolved into a deeper exploration of the topic, with both Harry and Joy maintaining their viewpoints while engaging more collaboratively. However, it's also clear that the conversation isn't fully resolved. The questions raised earlier about visibility, privacy, and public responsibility remain open, setting the stage for further discussion. And as the segment continues, there's a sense that the exchange may still develop in unexpected ways, depending on how the next questions are framed and answered. As the conversation moves forward, the shift toward a more reflective tone begins to give way to something slightly more pointed again. It's not abrupt, but there's a gradual tightening in the way the questions are framed and how the responses are delivered. The earlier exchange between Prince Harry and Joy Behar hasn't disappeared. It's simply been sitting beneath the surface, and now it starts to reemerge in a more defined way. One of the co-hosts introduces a related topic, bringing up how public figures often use media platforms to advocate for causes. The question is directed at Harry, asking how he balances personal storytelling with broader advocacy. It's a neutral entry point, but it naturally leads back into the same themes that have been building throughout the segment. Harry responds by explaining that, for him, the two are closely connected. He says that sharing personal experiences can help bring attention to larger issues, particularly when those experiences resonate with others. His tone remains composed, and he speaks in a way that feels consistent with his earlier answers, measured, thoughtful, and focused on the broader picture. As he speaks, the panel listens without interruption. There's a brief moment where it feels like the conversation might continue along this more general path. But then Joy leans in again, and the focus narrows. She acknowledges his point about advocacy, but then adds a layer that shifts the discussion back into a more challenging space. She raises the idea that when personal experiences are shared publicly, especially on a large scale, they can also shape public opinion in ways that go beyond advocacy. Her question centers on whether there's a responsibility to consider how those narratives affect others who may be connected to the story. The way she phrases it is careful, but the implication is clear. It's not just about what is being said, it's about the ripple effect of those statements. The studio becomes noticeably quieter again, with the kind of stillness that often accompanies more sensitive topics. Harry listens closely, his expression steady. When he responds, there's a subtle but clear shift in his tone. It's still calm, but there's more emphasis now, more precision in how he chooses his words. He acknowledges that sharing personal experiences can have broader implications, but he also stresses that those experiences are his to speak about. He explains that his intention has never been to place blame or create division, but rather to provide context for decisions that have been widely discussed and often misunderstood. As he speaks, there's a sense that he's addressing not just the question itself, but the underlying assumption behind it. Joy listens, but she follows up again, this time with a slightly more direct approach. She suggests that while personal ownership of a story is important, public storytelling can sometimes feel one-sided, particularly when others involved may not be part of the conversation. Her tone isn't confrontational, but it's firm enough to keep the tension present. There's a brief pause after she finishes, and one of the other co-hosts shifts in their seat, as if considering whether to step in. For a moment, no one speaks, and the silence itself becomes part of the exchange. Harry responds by reiterating that he can only speak from his own perspective. He emphasizes that his focus has been on explaining his experiences rather than defining anyone else's. His delivery remains controlled, but there's a slight tightening in his expression that suggests the conversation is becoming more personal than before. At this point, another co-host steps in, attempting to broaden the discussion again. She brings up the idea of public empathy, suggesting that audiences often respond to personal stories because they provide insight into situations that might otherwise feel distant. This comment helps to ease the intensity slightly, shifting the focus from individual responsibility to audience engagement. The conversation begins to expand again, with each host contributing a perspective on how stories are received and interpreted. There's a sense of the panel working collectively to keep the discussion balanced, even as the earlier tension continues to influence the tone. Joy, however, returns to the conversation with a comment that brings the focus back once more. This time, her tone is more reflective than challenging. She notes that part of the difficulty in these situations is that public figures are often navigating expectations that can't be fully met, being open enough to connect with audiences, while also maintaining boundaries that protect their personal lives. This shift in tone creates a moment of alignment. Harry nods slightly as she speaks, and when he responds, his tone mirrors that same sense of reflection. He agrees that the balance is difficult, and he acknowledges that there's no perfect way to navigate it. This exchange feels less like a debate and more like a shared recognition of complexity. For a brief stretch, the tension that defined the earlier parts of the segment seems to ease. The pacing slows again, and the conversation takes on a more thoughtful rhythm. The hosts allow each other more space to speak, and there are fewer interruptions. The studio audience remains attentive, with no audible reactions, which reinforces the sense that this is a more serious discussion. The camera captures small details, subtle nods, slight shifts in posture, moments of eye contact, that reflect the ongoing engagement between the participants. However, even as the tone becomes more measured, there's an underlying awareness that the conversation has touched on deeper issues that don't have simple answers. The earlier exchanges between Harry and Joy have set a foundation that continues to shape how each new point is received. As the segment approaches its later stages, one of the co-hosts introduces a question about moving forward. How public figures can continue to engage with audiences while navigating the challenges that have been discussed. It's a forward-looking question, one that invites reflection rather than debate. Harry responds by emphasizing the importance of intention and clarity. He speaks about the need to be honest about one's experiences while also being mindful of the broader context. His tone here is steady and composed, suggesting a return to the more balanced dynamic that the panel has been working toward. Joy listens, and this time she doesn't immediately follow up. Instead, she nods, allowing the point to settle. It's a small but noticeable change from earlier in the segment, where she was more quick to respond. From a viewer's perspective, this part of the conversation feels like a turning point. The tension hasn't disappeared, but it has evolved into something more nuanced. The disagreement is still there, but it's being expressed in a way that feels more constructive, more focused on understanding than on challenging. As this portion of the segment comes to a close, the discussion remains open-ended. The panel has explored multiple angles, with each participant contributing to a conversation that feels both grounded and complex. And while there have been moments of tension, they've been handled in a way that keeps the discussion within the bounds of what viewers expect from a daytime talk show: serious, respectful, and reflective of real-world conversations. As the segment continues into its later stretch, there's a noticeable sense that everyone at the table is aware of how far the conversation has already gone. The tone remains controlled, but there's a subtle shift in energy, less exploratory now, and a bit more focused on drawing out final points. The earlier back and forth between Prince Harry and Joy Behar still lingers, but it's now influencing the discussion in a quieter, more measured way. One of the co-hosts transitions the conversation by bringing up how public conversations like this one are received by viewers at home. It's a natural pivot, moving from the personal and the philosophical into something more immediate: how audiences interpret and react in real time. The question is directed to the panel as a whole, but it clearly invites Harry to reflect as well. Before he responds, there's a brief exchange among the hosts about the nature of live television. One of them points out that conversations like these are rarely as simple as they appear, especially when they involve deeply personal experiences. Another adds that viewers often form opinions based on only a portion of what's being discussed, which can sometimes lead to misunderstandings. Harry listens carefully, and when he begins speaking, his tone carries a slightly different quality than before. It's still calm, but there's a hint of resolution in how he frames his thoughts. He acknowledges that once something is said on a platform like The View, it takes on a life of its own. He explains that part of the challenge is accepting that not everyone will interpret his words in the way they were intended. As he speaks, the camera briefly cuts to Joy, who is listening with a more neutral expression than earlier. Her posture is relaxed, her hands resting on the table, signaling that she's not preparing to immediately challenge his point. The rest of the panel appears similarly composed, creating a moment of relative calm after the more layered exchanges that came before. Harry continues by emphasizing that his goal has never been to control public opinion, but rather to contribute to conversations that he believes are necessary. He speaks about the importance of dialogue, even when it involves disagreement, and notes that differing perspectives are part of what makes these discussions meaningful. This point seems to resonate across the panel. One of the co-hosts nods and adds that disagreement, when handled respectfully, can actually deepen understanding rather than divide people. The tone here is noticeably more collaborative, with each person building on the previous comment rather than pushing back against it. Joy then re-enters the conversation, and when she does, her tone reflects that same sense of balance. She acknowledges that the discussion has covered a lot of ground and notes that these topics don't have easy answers. Her voice is steady, and there's a slight softening in her delivery compared to earlier moments in the segment. However, she does raise one final point, this time framed less as a challenge and more as a closing observation. She mentions that public figures, particularly those with global recognition, often become symbols for larger conversations. Because of that, their words can carry weight beyond their personal intent. It's a measured statement, one that reflects her earlier concerns but presents them in a more reflective way. There's a brief pause after she speaks, and it feels different from the earlier silences. Instead of tension, it carries a sense of consideration. Harry nods slightly before responding, acknowledging the point without directly contesting it. He agrees that visibility comes with responsibility, and he reiterates that he's mindful of how his words might be received. At the same time, he emphasizes that authenticity is important, that speaking honestly about one's experiences is a key part of moving conversations forward. His tone is steady, and there's a sense that he's aiming to bring the discussion toward a constructive close. As he finishes, one of the co-hosts offers a brief summary of the conversation, highlighting the key themes that have come up: privacy, public responsibility, media dynamics, and audience perception. This kind of recap is common in segments like this, especially when the discussion has covered multiple angles. The audience remains quiet but attentive, and there's a subtle shift in body language across the panel. Shoulders relax slightly, and there's less of the forward-leaning posture that often signals active debate. It's the kind of change that suggests the conversation is beginning to wind down. Still, there's one more moment that stands out. Joy turns slightly toward the other hosts and makes a brief comment about the importance of continuing these discussions beyond a single segment. It's not directed at Harry specifically, but it reinforces the idea that the topics they've been discussing are ongoing and evolving. Harry responds with a short acknowledgement, expressing appreciation for the opportunity to have the conversation in a space where different viewpoints can be shared. His tone is calm and appreciative, and it helps to reinforce the more balanced atmosphere that has developed in the latter part of the segment. From a viewer's perspective, this portion of the exchange feels like a gradual settling after a more intense middle section. The disagreement hasn't been fully resolved, but it has been explored in a way that feels thorough and respectful. Each participant has had the opportunity to express their perspective, and there's a sense that the conversation has reached a natural stopping point. The camera begins to widen its focus, capturing the full panel rather than individual close-ups. This visual shift often signals that the segment is nearing its conclusion. The hosts exchange brief glances, and there's a sense of coordination as they prepare to transition. As this part of the segment comes to an end, the overall tone is one of measured closure. The earlier tension between Harry and Joy has evolved into a more reflective exchange, and while their perspectives remain distinct, the conversation has moved toward mutual acknowledgement rather than continued challenge. For viewers watching live, it's the kind of segment that stands out not because of any dramatic moment, but because of how it unfolded, gradually, thoughtfully, and with a clear sense of how live television can capture real-time dialogue in a way that feels both immediate and meaningful. As the segment moves into its final moments, there's a clear sense that the conversation has reached its natural conclusion. The energy at the table is calmer now, more settled compared to where it was earlier. The earlier tension between Prince Harry and Joy Behar hasn't disappeared, but it has softened into something more reflective, less about disagreement and more about perspective. One of the co-hosts begins the wrap-up by thanking Harry for joining the discussion, noting that conversations like this are not always easy, especially on live television. The tone is warm and professional, and it signals to viewers that the segment is coming to a close. Harry responds with a brief expression of appreciation, maintaining the same composed demeanor he's held throughout the exchange. As the camera cuts between the panel and Harry's remote feed, there's a noticeable shift in body language. The hosts sit back slightly, their posture more relaxed now, and the pace of the conversation slows even further. This is typical of how segments on The View transition out, moving from active discussion into a more reflective closing tone. Joy offers a final comment, and it's delivered in a way that feels consistent with how her tone has evolved over the course of the segment. She acknowledges that while there may be differences in how people view public responsibility and media engagement, it's important to have open conversations about those differences. Her voice is steady, and there's no sharpness in her delivery, just a clear, measured perspective. Harry nods as she speaks, and when he responds, he keeps his remarks brief. He reiterates that dialogue, even when it involves disagreement, is necessary. It's a concise statement, but it ties back to many of the points he made earlier. There's a sense that both sides are recognizing the value of the conversation itself, even if their views don't fully align. At this point, the audience offers a light round of applause. It's not loud or prolonged, but it's enough to signal appreciation for the discussion. The reaction feels appropriate for the tone of the segment, respectful rather than enthusiastic, acknowledging the seriousness of what was discussed. The hosts exchange quick closing remarks, and the camera widens to include the full panel. There's a brief moment of casual interaction, small smiles, slight nods, that reflects the shift away from the more focused intensity of the earlier conversation. Then the show transitions to the next segment. For viewers watching live, the experience doesn't end there. As is often the case with discussions like this, the conversation quickly extends beyond the broadcast. Clips from the segment begin circulating online, with particular attention given to the exchange between Harry and Joy. The way the conversation unfolded, calm but clearly layered, becomes a point of discussion in itself. On social media, reactions vary. Some viewers express support for Harry's perspective, emphasizing his points about personal boundaries and the importance of controlling one's narrative. Others align more closely with Joy's viewpoint, highlighting her emphasis on public accountability and the complexities of maintaining privacy while remaining in the public eye. What stands out in these reactions is that the conversation isn't reduced to a single moment. Instead, viewers reference different parts of the exchange: the initial question, the follow-up responses, the more reflective closing comments. It's a sign that the discussion resonated in a way that encouraged people to think rather than react immediately. Media outlets and commentators also pick up on the segment, often framing it as an example of how daytime talk shows can facilitate nuanced conversations. Rather than focusing on conflict, many analyses point to the balance that was maintained throughout the exchange. The way both Harry and Joy were able to express their perspectives without the conversation becoming confrontational. In follow-up discussions, some of the hosts briefly reference the segment in later episodes, noting the volume of viewer feedback it generated. They clarify that the intention was never to create tension, but to explore a topic that is relevant and often debated. This kind of acknowledgement is common, especially when a segment receives a strong response from audiences. From Harry's side, there are no immediate public statements directly addressing the exchange, but his earlier remarks continue to be quoted and discussed in various contexts. The focus remains on the themes he emphasized: privacy, intention, and the role of media in shaping public narratives. Looking back on the segment as a whole, what becomes clear is that the moment of tension was not defined by raised voices or dramatic interruptions. Instead, it was shaped by the gradual build of differing perspectives, the careful phrasing of questions, and the measured way those questions were answered. The exchange between Prince Harry and Joy Behar reflects the kind of discussion that viewers often see on The View. One where strong opinions are expressed, but within the structure of a respectful, moderated conversation. It's a reminder that not all impactful moments on television come from overt conflict. Sometimes, they come from the quieter tension of ideas being carefully examined in real time. As the episode fades into its next segment, and viewers continue discussing what they've just seen, the overall impression is one of a conversation that stayed grounded, even as it touched on complex and personal topics. And for many watching, that balance is what made the segment stand out. Share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to Prime Voice for more narration-based talk show stories.